Today we're going to talk about the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s and beyond. When we talk about civil rights in the United States, here's what we're talking about. Civil rights are the rights guaranteed to all persons in the United States according to the Constitution. These include equality under the law, the Bill of Rights, all of those things. But, as we've talked about many times in this class, our rights and laws are only as good as our will as citizens to make sure that they are enforced. And so these rights have been denied to vulnerable persons in the past, and during the Cold War, a lot of these groups are going to begin demanding changes. And before kind of the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of advances in civil rights brought about by the Second World War. World War II put into place the first workplace discrimination laws. After the war, Executive Order 9981 integrated the U.S. military, making it illegal for units to be segregated based on race. And also we talked about a lot of economic opportunities that become available to kind of disadvantaged groups like women and other minorities during World War II. But the most visible of these movements in the 1950s and 60s is the African American civil rights movement that's going to be focused primarily in the American South. When we talk about segregation in the 1950s and 60s, in the American South, there was actually legal segregation, laws that would separate and keep different groups of people, ethnic groups, apart. And in the South, these laws collectively are known as Jim Crow laws, and they're laws that make segregation legal. It means you have different schools, bathrooms, restaurants, drinking fountains, etc., and it is actually illegal for one group to use the facilities or other things that the other group can. So kind of the most vivid examples of these are things like white and colored restrooms, white and colored drinking fountains, as well as segregated schools. And a lot of the early victories of the civil rights movements are actually going to happen in the courts. Many challenges from the Mexican American community and also from the African American community brought court cases talking about how segregated schools were hurting children and were not equal. And so in 1954, in the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team were able to successfully argue that segregated schools could not be separate but equal. That because they were separate, they were inherently unequal. And so this decision, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, is going to end legal segregation in public schools, at least on paper. Meanwhile, throughout the South, the African American civil rights movement was organizing along lines of nonviolence and civil disobedience, focusing especially on boycotts. One of the first highly successful of these was the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, organized in 1955 and 56, which would be led by Martin Luther King Jr., then a relatively unknown civil rights leader. And the idea of civil disobedience and nonviolence is that you find a law that is unjust, and that after all legal challenges fail, courts, petitions, elections, that in order to protest the law, you actively refuse to obey the laws that you believe are unjust. However, you do this in a completely nonviolent way, a nonviolent protest, and you accept the consequences of breaking the law, even if it means imprisonment or violence perpetrated against your person. But just because Brown v. Board of Education was passed and said that schools needed to be desegregated, this didn't necessarily mean that it was going to happen. And so in Arkansas, there were 9 students chosen to integrate a high school in the capital of Little Rock. And in fact, President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1957 had to send the United States military to ensure that 1, these students be allowed to enter the building, and 2, to ensure their safety. But next year, in an effort to block integration of schools, Little Rock actually closed all of its public schools, signaling that this would be a serious fight throughout the 50s and 60s. On top of the Little Rock Nine and Ruby Bridges, another young girl who's chosen to integrate a school, there was also the attempt to desegregate the buses in the South. So a group of people called Freedom Riders began integrating buses and riding them from town to town around the South to try to break segregation. These people were often met with violence, and the early days of the civil rights movement are going to be characterized by a violent struggle between those trying to hold on to segregation and those fighting to end it. Also, sit-ins at lunch counters that were supposed to be white-only in the doorways of white-only businesses are going to continue to use nonviolent protest to put pressure upon the establishment in the South to end the Jim Crow segregation. In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in the South, a campaign was brought by Martin Luther King Jr. and others in order to try to end segregation in the city. They were met by intense violence, especially from Chief of Police Bull Connor, and things like fire hoses, attack dogs, and others were used to try to stop these protests from happening. Also, the March on Washington, another kind of big part of the movement in which a large number of both white and African American supporters marched on Washington, D.C., demanding, in their words, jobs and freedom. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in outlining the goals of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And ultimately, a lot of these events were highly successful, resulting in enough pressure being put on the United States government to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There is Martin Luther King Jr. meeting with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a historic piece of legislation that outlawed all forms of public discrimination based on race, gender, ethnicity, or religion. And it also guaranteed voting rights for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or gender. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to be important for the work of ending segregation in the United States. And after the Civil Rights Act, the African American Civil Rights Movement continued their nonviolent protest and their work to try to end segregation and discrimination in the American South. However, even after the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of these marches are going to end up turning violent, including the very famous Selma to Montgomery March that ends with violence when the protesters tried to cross a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The resulting scene involved deputy policemen beating protesters, children running, and it ended up kind of being a big moment in pointing out kind of the cruelty of civil rights violations in the United States during that time. But outside of the Jim Crow segregation of the South, there was also struggles in the North. And in the North, although the segregation and discrimination was not put into law, it was still there. And a good example of this is Chicago. Chicago in the 1950s and 60s is the most segregated northern city. It does not have open housing, which means that essentially if you are a minority looking to buy a home, you will be denied access through kind of any number of means like real estate agents or loan officers who won't give you a loan, so that they only allow you to move into certain areas. That is what de facto segregation means, that though it's not legal, it is still discrimination. And so, limited economic opportunities, limited jobs, also segregated schools, and incredible disparities between the schools in some of the white neighborhoods and in the minority areas of the city. Chicago is also plagued by racial violence and the belief that the Chicago police force was used to keep certain groups in certain parts of the city. Eventually, movements such as the Coordinating Council of Community Organizers, the Chicago Freedom Movement, would try to fight back against Chicago's segregation and discrimination. However, still today, Chicago remains one of the most segregated cities in the country. But though the American Civil Rights Movement is the most visible, this was a time when many groups of Americans began advocating for greater acceptance and civil rights in American society. One of these is very little known, but it's the American Indian movement, and its purpose was to improve the conditions for American Indians in the United States. Most American Indians were forced to live on reservations, and when they left those reservations, they faced discrimination outside. And so this movement came up with an idea called Red Power, pride in American Indian identity and culture. And they carried out a series of protests throughout the 1960s and 70s. The most famous of these in 1969 through 71 was the occupation of the abandoned prison on Alcatraz Island, in which a group of American Indian movement members went to the island and lived there, claiming that they were occupying the island because they were reclaiming it in the name of the Native Americans. And they issue a statement reversing the roles of the United States and the American Indians, making a fake treaty like the ones that the United States had these tribes sign kind of in the 1800s. Then in 1973, the movement turned violent, and at Wounded Knee, the site of a major battle in 1890 of a massacre of the Lakota Sioux, the American Indians armed themselves and took over Wounded Knee and even fought the United States government when the occupation only ended after a person was killed by gunfire. Both sides agreed to stop. But again, this showed that during the 1960s and 70s, tensions among different groups of Americans were very high. There's also another movement that starts during this time, and that's the gay liberation movements. And the gay liberation movement started in 1969 in New York City at a place called the Stonewall Inn. And in New York City, the police have been harassing the gay community and they raided a nightclub called the Stonewall Inn in order to try to arrest members of the gay community for what they were doing. But what happened is riots ensued, where kind of these gay men and women fought the police, and a riot broke out. And from this point forward, a gay liberation movement will be created to protest laws discriminating in the United States and to fight for acceptance. Here's a picture of some of the Stonewall riots. And this is kind of the start of the gay liberation movement that has gained so much steam today. There's also a women's liberation movement in which women are going to advocate for their equality in American society. And the women's liberation movement is going to come up with an idea called feminism. And feminism was the belief that men and women should be equal politically, economically, and socially. And their idea of feminism was to fight against discrimination against women in jobs, being able to get bank credit and loans, political positions, as well as kind of denying access to the upper echelons of American business and society. And so the women's liberation movement was successful in getting many key pieces of legislation passed. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 guaranteed women equal pay. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 expressly included women. And Title IX in 1972 said that schools could not discriminate against young women by forcing them to take certain classes or by not allowing women to have sports teams along with the men's sports teams. And so all of those seeds that were sown during World War II for women's liberation and women's equality are going to culminate in this fight in the 1960s and 70s for fair treatment. During the same time, there was also a large movement among Mexican Americans that would result in a series of gains for Mexican Americans in the United States. And when we talk about Mexicans in the United States, we have to talk about labor. And labor under the Bracero program and also migrant workers, these labor conditions are going to be very, very difficult. There's very few protections for these migrant workers. They have very few rights, low pay, kind of almost no benefits. And the majority of Mexicans in the U.S. were agricultural workers throughout the Southwest during the 1940s and 50s. And so these agricultural workers, many of them came in during the Bracero program during World War II. But most of them found that the United States was not particularly welcoming for them despite the need for their labor. And so in the 1960s, there's a movement that comes up that is going to involve organizing Mexican American laborers in the United States. And it's going to be led by Cesar Chavez. And by the 1960s, there are about 9 million Hispanic Americans in the United States, most of them concentrated in California and the Southwest. And Cesar Chavez, along with others, created a movement called the United Food Workers, in which they tried to organize these exploited laborers into a union. They carried out a series of strikes against very poor conditions and pay, and they also organized a national boycott of California grapes that would end up extending to 17 million Americans. And so finally by 1970, this labor movement had put enough pressure on California grape growers for them to sign a union contract with the laborers of the United Food Workers. And so Cesar Chavez, a big kind of leader of the labor movement, is going to also set off another more radical movement known as the Chicano movement. Very large strides of political activism and resistance have been brought into the community through the labor activists, and would soon translate to students and other members of the community. And politically, in the United States in the 50s and 60s, ethnic Mexicans had experienced a very difficult time. Racial boundaries in cities between neighborhoods were very aggressively policed. Unjust arrests and civil rights violations were common, and deportations were even more common. And for the ethnic Mexicans in the United States, they really had almost no political representation of their own within any of the political parties. And this tension between ethnic Mexicans and other Americans went back as far as the 1940s, with the very famous Zoot Suit riots involving American sailors and Mexican-American young men during World War II. And in 1954, there was a mass deportation called Operation Wetback. Yes, that was the real name. And this mass deportation involved a lot of U.S. citizens even, and those who did not qualify as undocumented workers in the United States. There were widespread allegations of abuse, and this would be another moment that would kind of galvanize the community to start organizing for action and political representation. And so from this, new ideas about activism are going to grow out of the farmer movement as well as the experience politically of this community. And one of these early organizers was Corky Gonzalez, and he's kind of the true founder of what grew into the Chicano movement. He was based out of Denver, and he was a very active political representative of the community. He became very frustrated with the major political parties, and even left the Democratic National Committee in order to pursue his own organizing of ethnic Mexicans in the United States for political purposes. And he organized the first National Chicano Youth Conference, a very large organizing conference of Chicano youth for political action, as well as the Chicano protest known as the Vietnam Moratorium Committee in the 1970s. And nowhere was this movement felt more than in education. And especially in California schools, especially in LA, the conditions were very poor for these Mexican-American students. They often experienced racism, such as being called slurs in the classroom, had unsanitary restrooms in other places. The students were forced to work as janitors. There was often violence, sometimes initiated, or at least kind of teachers and other administrators would look the other way. There was also very few Latinos involved in the school, poor food, and immensely overcrowded classrooms, causing the students to not get a proper education. They also complained about teachers not wanting to teach and saying that, oh, well, they're just Mexicans, they can't learn anything. And so in response, Chicano students organized, and they organized the LA blowouts in 1968, in which over 1,000 students walked out of the schools demanding better classrooms, more classes, better conditions, and their involvement and the change in order to give them an opportunity. And so 10,000 students are going to walk out of the schools throughout East LA asking for better education conditions. And in many ways, their student activism is going to work. They're going to win concessions from the school, such as the Bilingual Education Act, which said that classes must be taught in a student's native language while they are learning English, which meant that recent immigrant students would not be left behind. And it also set the stage for even more organizations in the future, such as the National Chicano Moratorium Committee that protested racism and also Chicanos' involvement in the Vietnam War, a war that they said was fought for a country that didn't provide them with civil rights. And the movement began to gain steam in 1969 when there was a conference in Denver bringing together all of these politicized youths from all over the United States. But they're going to kind of struggle with the search for what a Chicano is, for that Mexican-American voice in politics in the 1960s and 70s. There's a lot of different ideas about this, but kind of overall is this idea that we're not from here, we're not from there. And so understanding that a unique identity must be created. They come up with the idea of Aztlán, which is a Chicano homeland in the American Southwest that the Mexican Americans should retake and declare an independent country. Now, they kind of made up a lot of history and different things with that, and it didn't ever actually, no one ever really took it all that seriously, but it kind of became symbolic of a frame of mind, of an idea of kind of a homeland within the United States for these people. But kind of out of this movement has also created an intense violent movement called the Brown Berets, who armed themselves and fought against the police in Los Angeles, declaring themselves the defenders of the community and fighting against the police. And so ultimately when we talk about Chicanos, we're not just talking about Mexican Americans. We're talking about a movement that involves highly politicized Mexican Americans who believe in a rejection of white American values and basically the creation of an independent Aztlan, an independent homeland for Mexican Americans in the United States. So this movement is going to kind of die out as Mexican Americans are going to seek to enter the political mainstream, but this movement is going to win a lot of changes in American society. And the legacy is this. It's going to organize a large number of Mexican American youth for political action. A lot of the same ones who are going to be involved in U.S. politics in the decades to come. It won civil rights in schools for migrant workers, and it kind of began forming a unique identity for this group in the United States. And kind of the disagreements within the Chicano movement showed up in all the civil rights movements. There were disagreements about the strategy. In the African American civil rights movements, those who were dissatisfied with nonviolent action advocated more radical ideas like black power. Within the Chicano movement, more radical groups like the Brown Berets are going to disagree, and also they're going to disagree on strategy. Should we focus on the South, the North, cities, country? And so ultimately this is going to involve the splintering off of a lot of these groups, where some groups are going to turn more violent, be less willing to work within the system and with the white community, and believing that real change required more radical action. And so, the legacy of the civil rights movement is mixed, and ultimately we are still dealing with a lot of these issues today.